co-facilitators for the Barossa Improved Grazing Group. Just a bit of background on BIGG. We are an umbrella organisation for Barossa livestock producer groups, including a sheep, a beef, a dairy and 2 ag bureaus. We're run under the administration of the Angaston Ag Bureau, and we're completely producer driven. We have both facilitators who are local farmers, and we have a really active advisory committee. Our main aim with BIGG is to support innovative, productive and sustainable grazing systems in our region. We like to deliver projects which are working with local producers, obviously. Currently some of our projects include an MLA producer demonstration site, which is looking at productive pastures for variable climates. Fits very well into what we're talking about tonight. We also have a Natural Resources Adelaide Mount Lofty Ranges subsoil monitoring project, which is observing and utilising information for 3 soil moisture probes located around the region. For any more information about BIGG, please visit our website. You'll see the link just there on the screen. You can find lots of different producer case studies about things we've been involved with: soils, pasture, watercourse rehabilitation, fire recovery. We also have current weather information and soil moisture monitoring, a newsletter sign-up form so you can keep updated with BIGG, and lots of other BIGG related information. Now for this webinar tonight, it is supported by the South Australian Murray-Darling Basin Natural Resources Management Board through the NRM Levies, and also funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare program. It's also supported, as I said earlier, by Meat and Livestock Australia through their producer demonstration site project. And we also have some local rural businesses who are partnering with us in that project, Farmer John's and Creepers Mount Pleasant. Now for this webinar, as farmers we all know how variable the seasons are becoming. We're looking for rain here at the moment. We need to be able to work with the forecasts and with what the season's bringing us, so that we can not only make the most of the opportunities that are presented to us in our grazing systems, but we also need to look at ways that we can manage the risk and whether we can reduce the risk or whether there's an opportunity to turn it into something that can be profitable for us. So providing us with a bit of an overview on how we can do this tonight for this upcoming season, we have our local consultant Hamish Dickson. Hamish is a principal consultant for AgriPartner Consulting and has over 15 years experience in the ag industry, working in roles both on farm and off. He has specialist knowledge on ruminant production systems and is regularly called on to assist with advice, training and research in sheep and cattle nutrition, management and financial analysis. So just before we get into the nitty-gritty with Hamish, I'll hand back over to Carlin, and she's going to have a couple of poll questions quickly to get us started. Thanks, Carlin.
Thanks, Georgie. Just to get us rolling and to provide some context for the session this evening, if you'd like to answer the question on your screen, where are you listening from tonight? Just click away on the screen for the option that best fits you, and then that'll just add some context for Hamish as he's delivering. So I can see 3/4 of you have voted. All right, that's nearly everybody. So the results of that are, everyone, 90% have come from another location, including outside of SA. So we'll actually gather your exact location in the evaluation at the end of tonight. So that'll be interesting for Georgie's project. So the next question we'd like to ask you is, which best describes your predominant pasture? Are you a perennial pasture system or an annual pasture sown in a feed in a cropping rotation? So again, if you'd like to click on your screen to give us some background information there. And I can see that nearly all of you have voted on that one, so I'll shut that one off shortly. So showing that 71% of you best describe your system as a perennial pasture, and 29% is the annual pasture system. So that will help Hamish with some context for you. And the final poll we'd like some feedback on is, do you complete a written feed budget? Oh, sorry, need to click the right button. Do you complete a written feed budget at least once per year to forward plan pasture availability? Yes or no? Okay, I can see the majority of you have voted there. So the weight of those results is to the no. 86% of people don't complete a written feed budget at least once per year. So that's good to know. Some feedback for our presentation tonight. So I'm just going to pass the baton across to Hamish, and we'll be able to see Hamish's screen. Welcome, Hamish.
Thanks, Carlin. That's great. Can you just see that screen now? Just check we're all good.
All good.
Excellent, not a problem. All right. Look, thanks, Carlin, for the introduction, and to Georgie and the BIGG group for, I guess, the invitation to speak tonight. We're going to really go through a little bit around looking, I guess, at the season in front of us and how do we identify some opportunities that may be presented throughout the season. Where does feed budgeting come into all of this discussion as well? And it's really good that we've actually had the opportunity to do some of those polls beforehand to look at what the reality is in terms of people undertaking feed budgets. To have 86% of us say that we don't regularly undertake written feed budgets is not all that surprising. It's something that doesn't happen as often as it could or possibly should do. So we'll go through some discussion around what the role of it is and how it's done and how it can fit into our overall topic of looking at capturing opportunities throughout the season as well. Throughout a lot of this discussion, we will look at what types of feeds and pastures may suit given different seasonal conditions and forecasts. And we'll also have a chat towards the end around looking at production targets and how do we actually put in a system of actually measuring our productivity to really assess and measure our management. It's measuring the overall productivity of the whole enterprise, but that's really a reflection of how well we are managing our systems as well. So we'll go through all of that. We've got about 20 minutes or so to go through, I guess, the core presentation tonight, and then there is some time afterwards that's been allowed in terms of going through some Q&A from yourselves. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please, as Carlin said, put them in the notes and put your hand up, and we can address those towards the end. Especially with quite a lot of those of you that are online coming from outside of the Barossa and particularly even outside of SA, there will be some information and there will be some queries that you might have that address sort of different production systems to what we're talking about here today, and that's quite fine to go through those afterwards. A lot of the principles that we'll be going through aren't particularly specific to just, you know, a South Australian Barossa or mid-north type scenario. They're broad principles that apply equally to sheep and cattle, and whilst we'll have some focus on it on a few sheep examples, the principles of how they work equally apply to cattle as well. So getting into it, at this stage of the season where we're at is that we are seeing right now some indications that there may be some rain, particularly on the eastern side of Australia. For South Australia, that may or may not eventuate. We've certainly seen some fairly big forecasts coming through just recently saying that we will get reasonable amounts of rainfall coming through, but it hasn't eventuated. So whilst these forecasts are here at the moment, we need to be conscious of the fact that in terms of what we're looking at for projecting further forward and trying to capture longer term opportunities, the here and now of what's going to happen today or tomorrow is less relevant. What we really want to be looking at is what is the current seasonal forecast, looking further ahead. And one of the things I guess tonight is that I'm not from the Bureau, I'm not a meteorologist. What we're going to go through is, given certain seasonal forecasts, how can we use that information to try and improve productivity within the systems? One resource that you can use if you're not aware already is that the Bureau of Meteorology has some very good short videos that provide a quick summary of the current seasonal conditions and what the forecasts are for the next 2 to 3 months. There's a link here, and we can probably send it out afterwards as well if you're interested in it. And they're very good short videos. These are just a couple of snippets out of the latest one, and in fact the new projection video will actually come out, I think, on the 25th of May, which will look a little bit further ahead than July 2017. So if you're interested in this, stay tuned and check out this video on that date. But this is just a very brief forecast for now.
Welcome to the Climate and Water Outlook from May to July 2017. Although heavy rain fell across parts of Australia over the past month, some areas, such as Western Queensland, have once again missed out on summer rain. Outlooks suggest a warm and dry season ahead. So in summary, the El Niño watch continues. Rainfall is likely to be below average for much of Australia, near median to high stream flows across the east, and temperatures are expected to be warmer than average. For more details, visit our website at bom.gov.au/climate/ahead.
Okay, so basically it's very short and simple at this stage, and given that the forecast at this stage is suggesting that it's going to be a fairly warm and dry winter and possibly early spring, some of the things we need to think about is what are the opportunities that are available to us. And one of the ways that I really look at the core of how we assess this is what are our main drivers of productivity. And for us, it's all about moisture. How we utilise that moisture in terms of how we grow feed and how we utilise that feed is up to our management. But one of the things we need to be really conscious of is monitoring the rainfall that we do have and thinking about how that will project forward in terms of the pasture growth that we can achieve. So this year, we've certainly had good levels of early rainfall. This is just showing us really our monthly spread of rainfall for a median year, which is the grey bars, and for 2017 in the yellow. So you can see that for a location in the Barossa, somewhere like Tanunda, and in fact for a lot of areas throughout South Australia, and especially in the mid-north region, we have this very winter-dominant rainfall pattern, which is not too surprising. We don't get a lot of rainfall throughout the summer, and even that sort of early autumn period. It's not until we start getting into April, May that we start to get that increase in rainfall. So whilst this median is a pattern of winter rainfall, you can see that in 2017 we have actually had quite good early rain. You know, throughout January, February and April we've well and truly exceeded the median levels of moisture that we'd normally expect. The other thing just to keep in mind, and this is probably particularly pertinent for those that are outside of SA, is that often when we're looking at different pasture species, sometimes we'll look at pasture species that are more suited to a summer rainfall system. So we need to be careful about comparing or potentially bringing in different pasture species from regions outside of our area here that are better suited to a different rainfall pattern. Certainly if you go to somewhere, say, from central New South Wales north and northern Australia, where we start getting into more even rainfall patterns throughout the year, or even into summer dominant rainfall patterns throughout the year, it means that the pasture options that are available to us or available to them can certainly change quite a bit. And that's one of the things that I often see working with a lot of farmers and clients, is that we might be looking at different fodder crop options which are highly suited to growing throughout that sort of September, October, November, December period, or even into January and February. And in situations or locations where we have good levels of summer rainfall, they perform incredibly well and they produce huge bulks of feed. But in areas where we have a very winter dominant rainfall pattern, their use is really quite limited. So for us, looking at opportunities this year, I'll look at our rainfall pattern so far, and that we've had good levels of rainfall so far. We've got fairly good levels of moisture within the soil at this point in time. Yes, we're always looking for a little bit more right now to keep going with the sowing programs. But given the forecast ahead as well is looking towards that drier and warmer winter and spring, I start to get nervous about a little bit as to what's going on later on in the year. If you start to look at some of the seasons that we've had where we've had very dry springs coming through, you can start to see how much difference it actually has to our normal season. So the red bars which have been overlaid here now show the to an under rainfall in 2014, which was one of those seasons where we had a very short spring. You can see how little rain occurred from August onwards. And this is where we have an impact in that we're relying generally on quite a lot of our spring growth in terms of feed and pasture availability. And if we have a big limitation to moisture in that time, then our potential for finishing stock, for carrying stock, is very much decreased. So in terms of projecting forward and looking at the season ahead and how can we capture opportunities, I look at where we're at right now and I look at the forecast of what we've got, and I think that we really need to be making sure that whatever pasture options we're looking at now are utilising the moisture and growing for the next few months. We don't want to be looking at putting in pastures or sown feed options that are going to be producing the bulk of their feed throughout, say, August, September, October, November. We need pastures and feeds that will be growing right away. So a lot of those sorts of options start to look at things like even sown cereals, plus or minus some legume contents, whether it's something like a vetch or a pea at the same time as well. So we'll go into that in a moment, but when we're really looking at these opportunities, I think it's important to take a step back and say, okay, well, what is the driver of productivity on the farm? And use that as your decision point around what are the opportunities that we can actually work towards and look at. Right now, one of the things that I think is also important to look at is, especially with perennial pasture systems and especially with native pasture systems, as we've got a lot of throughout the hills in the Barossa, we need to look at what's going on with current pasture growth rates. This is Pastures from Space and their projections or their estimates of current pasture growth rates from last week, so up until yesterday, basically the 16th of May. So you can see right now that pasture growth rates on the whole have actually decreased. They're right down quite low in that 0 to 10 kilograms per hectare per day range. So that's not unusual to see. Certainly as we're going throughout the season and as we come into winter and spring, we'll tend to see that normally the pasture winter growth rates will come right down to somewhere around 3 to 5 kilograms per hectare per day. So one of the things that you can start to look at using Pastures from Space is what are the annual changes throughout pasture growth rates. And you can see here, this is the Barossa district pasture growth rates for a number of years. And if you haven't seen this information before and you want to access it for your own district, have a look at just Google the Pastures from Space website, and you'll be able to get in and dig through there to find this information, or else we can add a link and help direct you to it as well. But you can see that now we're coming into May, and comparatively to other years, we are sitting fairly low in terms of the pasture growth rates that we've got right now. And you can see that realistically, with a lot of perennial pasture systems, native pasture systems, we're not going to expect them to increase massively in growth rate until we get into August and September. So given the forecast that we've got, given the amount of moisture that we've got available to us, one of the things we need to be thinking about is how can we actually start to grow a bulk of feed sooner than later so that we've actually got some feed resources up and we're utilising that moisture before it's actually lost later on in the year. The other thing that's actually really important when we start looking at how we actually look at opportunities throughout the year is to have a really clear understanding as to what the demands on our system are at any one point throughout the year. It's really important that when we start looking at different opportunities that are available to us, we have a clear understanding as how they'll fit within our system, because there will always be a whole range of different opportunities that may be presented in terms of different feed options that we can put in, different feed options that we could potentially grow or sell and purchase, but we need to make sure that it fits. And if you start to look at the demand in terms of the requirements of animals throughout the year, you can start to see when the demand is highest for a breeding flock, when it's highest for your growing stock or finishing stock. And that should help you actually make some decisions around what quality and quantity of feed is needed at any one point of the year. This is kind of linked to our feed budgets in that quite often you'll find that the energy requirements of animals should be, or our feed availability should be well aligned to the energy and feed requirements of our stock. That's the best way to actually allow us to run the optimal level of stock on any one property. Stocking rate is is the biggest profit driver within any breeding and finishing enterprise. It's also one that needs to be correct. It's not a simple matter of just increasing and increasing stocking rate higher and higher. There is a point where we go too far with stocking rate and our returns are actually reduced after that point. So we need to be really careful that we do get it spot on. If you look at the energy requirements of a breeding flock, and you can see this yellow shading in the bottom half is of a breeding flock, and in this particular example we're looking at a sheep enterprise where they're lambing through May and June. They then might be weaning lambs around September, and you can see that we have this bigger increase in energy requirements as we come through April, May, June, July, as we come into lambing and lactation. You can overlay things like your replacement hoggets over the top of that, and you can see that we have a big demand for quality of feed throughout that winter period, and even coming into spring, which will probably start to fill that gap as we start looking at the weaner lambs. But from the breeding flock point of view, you can see that our biggest demand is through May, June, July. So in this instance, if an opportunity was presented with the season to say, look, we want to try and grow a whole lot of feed throughout summer, it doesn't have a big fit. It doesn't fit very well with the demand of our enterprise. So right here, if you're looking at this sort of system, any opportunities that we're looking at grabbing need to be able to fill this energy demand through the winter period. So once again, given that the forecast that we're looking at is that we've got the potential for a warm and dry winter, plus the fact that we've got a whole lot of moisture available right now, or more than usual, there's a big opportunity to start trying to grow feed now to actually fill this gap here, rather than necessarily just waiting for it to be coming through later on in the season. If you start to overlay the requirements, particularly in terms of energy and protein for our young stock, and these principles apply equally to cattle or different lambing periods, you can start to see that we have a big demand for those weaners coming through from August onwards. Okay, and how much that, or how far that demand continues to project, will depend a little bit on how quick the growth rates are, when they're turned off, and all those sorts of different factors. But you can start to see that we have a demand through that later part of the year to finish stock. So one of the challenges will be, how do we do that if we end up with a warm, dry winter and spring? Because we won't achieve the same levels of pasture growth, of feed growth that we normally have to finish those animals in a typical season. So we need to look at how can we capture some of the moisture, some of the rain that we're hopefully going to be getting in the short term, and carry a lot of that feed over till later in the year. One of the things we can be thinking about in that instance is, are there ways that we can actually grow a bulk of feed now and carry it all the way through? And once again, that starts to lend itself back towards something like even putting in the simple sown cereals, plus or minus something like a vetch in there. Because with those sorts of feeds, there's nothing wrong with letting those feeds go all the way through, letting them ripen, and allowing those feed resources to be available to stock as a grazing resource come November, December, as dry, ripened crop. You know, you've got to resist the urge in that sort of situation to put the header through it, but that sort of system can actually provide very good quality feed for finishing animals. And in that sort of way, what you're doing is you're producing the bulk of your growth in the season that sort of plant and that sort of crop will grow, so through the winter and early spring. And you're not reliant on the rainfall that may or may not come later in the year. The other thing that's really important when we're trying to look at how do we capture these opportunities is we need to be able to work out what do we need to be looking at from a feed quantity point of view. With all of these sorts of discussions or these sorts of decisions that we're looking at, we need to understand, well, how much feed do we actually need? How much feed is required for our young stock? How much feed is required for our breeding flock? And to do that, we really need to be looking at undertaking some feed budgets. So we're going to briefly go through the process of these. They are relatively complicated, and that's one of the reasons why we actually don't find that they're done as often as they could or should be. Feed budgeting really is just a method by which we calculate out how much feed we currently have on hand, how much we expect to grow across the property over the next 3 or 6 months or 12 months period, and what is the demand in terms of the animal requirements that we have on hand at any one point throughout the year. The whole process is about being proactive in the decisions that we make. It's about being able to prepare for seasonal challenges, being able to prepare for shortfalls in feed availability, and likewise it's about being able to maximise our pasture utilisation, especially in seasons where we have more growth than what we necessarily need. So we've had some seasons like that recently where we've certainly grown a lot more feed than we've required, and undertaking feed budgets in advance can actually help us to project that surplus and allow us to utilise that feed through, potentially trading some stock, and that allows us to really utilise that feed earlier and sooner whilst it's actually maintained the best quality. As I mentioned before, look, stocking rate's really important in terms of our overall enterprise profitability. It's our biggest profit driver, so it's one that whilst there's some time involved in doing a feed budget, it actually makes very good business sense to do it regularly. The process is fairly simple in terms of actually just talking about it, but there is a lot of number crunching. It's a case of looking at how much feed do we have on hand right now, which is our feed on offer, our food. What's the projected supply of feed that's going to be provided from our pasture growth rate over the next several months. Then we calculate out the animal demand, and that's using our DSE ratings. It's using how many kilograms of feed are these different animals going to be consuming. That's calculated out for each class of animal on the farm. It's calculated out for each month, projecting forward. And when you balance those two, you can start to see where we have surpluses and where we have shortfalls that might need to be addressed. Once you work through that, there are a range, or to work through that sort of information, that there are a range of, I guess, support tools that are available. Lots of people have access to some different calculators and spreadsheets that are available, so you may have an advisor that can help you with that. Industry resources like Making More from Sheep and More Beef from Pastures have online tools that can help you input a lot of that data and work through your feed budget for the season ahead. And likewise, some of the other programs like Evergraze have some good online resources as well, and I'll put up some links to that at the end of the presentation as well. As I mentioned, looking at and going through that sort of exercise, it allows you to understand exactly when there may be some deficits in the future that need to be addressed. That can then allow you to make some decisions around, are there options that I need to be looking at in terms of either putting in feed resources to fill those gaps? Do I need to be looking at supplementary feeding? Should I have containment fed stock at this point? It may mean that you need to be looking at getting rid of some stock numbers as well for a short period. Or it may be that you're actually looking at a longer term change to the whole system. So it might be that you look at balancing the breeding versus the trading numbers within any sort of enterprise as well. Likewise, on the other hand, when we're looking at a surplus, it might be that if we have higher levels of feed than required, then you might be looking at potentially buying in stock to trade. You might be looking at increasing the breeding flock size for the short term as well. You might be able to reallocate some paddocks if you're in a mixed enterprise to crop, or you might be looking at a year where it's a good time to actually conserve some feed for future seasons as well. So all of those decisions I find often are made on the fly, and often are made on gut feel and a bit of experience. And whilst that can work occasionally and can work, it's a lot more, it gives the producers a lot more confidence when we actually work through this in terms of the feed budgets, and producers tend to actually keep coming back to doing this exercise once they've done it once or twice and can see the accuracy and can see the value that it provides. In terms of actually looking at some of these opportunities that we can capture, one of the things we need to be really conscious of is that the opportunities will change year to year. They'll change probably even season to season and month to month. We need to have a way of actually measuring the success of those decisions. We need to have a way of measuring and learning from our management decisions, and there are a whole range of industry benchmarks that are available to look at this information. These are available online. These are some industry enterprise benchmarks from the Making More from Sheep website, obviously for a sheep enterprise. And this can give you some information around, well, what is a good guide for performance for how much wool we should be producing per hectare, how much lamb we should be producing per hectare, what sort of stocking rates, what sort of gross margins, what sort of cost of production. Obviously, within all of these numbers, there are benchmarks within that around what levels of land survival, what levels of growth rate we should be achieving. All of these factors will come into how we can assess the success of any decisions that have been made to really capture an opportunity. And I think to actually continue to learn and continue to improve our enterprises, we do need to make sure that we have a way of recording and measuring this data. One of the things to keep in mind is that I think the biggest reason a lot of this information isn't ever looked at often enough is that we don't have good systems to actually record the data that we need. So think about the systems that you have in place to be able to actually measure and record information. And if you have the data there, then you can certainly work with someone to actually dig that data out and analyse it and figure out what learnings can we take from it and how can we improve our decision-making process for next time as well. Likewise, just as much for beef as there is for sheep, those same benchmarks exist. One of the things that I think is actually really important though is that we are very accurate in how we actually measure that data and what we present and what we assess. One of the common things that I hear is that we work with a lot of producers on improving reproductive rates. And the starting point for me is to say, okay, well, where are we at right now? What's our current reproductive rates? And someone might say to me, right, look, we're currently marking 110% out of our flock, out of our sheep flock. At that point, I can generally say, okay, well, that's actually not too bad. There's some room for improvement, but we're certainly not at the bottom end. But you need to dig into these numbers a little bit more. Quite often, what happens is that we need to make sure we are presenting the right numbers and we are accurately recording the numbers, particularly to compare to industry benchmarks, so that they're on the same format and the same measure. So in this example, quite often we might have a scenario where someone's joined, say, 2,300 ewes. They've marked 36 lambs. Now, that actually works out as a true marking rate of 108%. So there's a little bit of rounding up that's been done. But one of the things that commonly happens in this scenario is that someone's then said, oh, well, look, we did actually take the dries out because it was canned. And we also had a few deaths that have come out. So the marking rate that we said has actually been calculated from the lambs over the ewes at marking time, not the ewes that were joined. So that's actually really important, because what that means is in this situation, we weren't actually marking 110%, it was 97%. So these sorts of little small differences need to be actually really clearly identified, because when we're actually looking at a lot of the benchmarks, we're looking at how do we measure the success of our decisions, how do we measure continual improvement within the business. We have to make sure that we're actually recording data, we have to make sure that we are presenting data in the right way, and we're presenting it in a way that's actually comparable to benchmarks that we're trying to set as well. So that's just one example. There's lots of different pieces of information that you might look at. The piece of information that's relevant is very much very much related to what the change in your system is looking at. So if we're looking at putting in an opportunity for, say, the weaners later on in the season, we're trying to look at a feed situation that can carry some quality feed for them later on in the year. The things that would be most relevant to that are things like, okay, well, has that decision actually allowed us to change the stocking rate of those lambs? Can we carry more on a smaller area? Is the growth rate of those lambs higher? And have they actually met market specs better? Are they in the right fat score? Are they actually achieving good value, good returns at the other end? So we need to be thinking about what the opportunity is and what value is there. So look, just as a brief overview before we sort of take a few questions and can get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty around particular areas. When we're looking at opportunities for the season, the first thing is assess where we're at right now. How much moisture have we got? What's the forecast going forward? And then we can actually look at understanding some feed budgets to determine, well, where are we at right now feed-wise? Where do we actually require some feed in the future, given the forecasts that are available to us? And certainly we need to understand the enterprise demands that we have. When do we actually require high quality feed? When do we have requirements, or when do we have high demand from our flock or our herd? so that any opportunities that we're going to play around with, they have to align to that. They have to make sure that they're going to fill a really good gap, and in that way we're going to get the best bang for our buck of whatever decisions that we're making. Right now it's a case of use moisture. You know, moisture is one of our biggest drivers. It grows our pasture, it grows, which allows us to carry higher stocking rates, which is a big profit driver. So when we have moisture, we have to try and utilise it. We have to convert it to feed. So right now I'm looking at a situation where we've actually got some levels of moisture that we need to be able to utilise, especially with the forecast going forward, which is indicating that it's going to be potentially a warmer and drier season. So we've got to utilise what we've got right now. And the last thing is like I said towards the end there, make sure that we measure our enterprise performance so that we can measure our management, we can measure our decisions that we've made and determine whether there's actually any improvements that we can make next year and the year after that as well. A couple of links to resources there, so make sure you check out if things like Making More from Sheep and More Beef from Pastures. They've got a lot of the information that we've been discussing here on things like feed budgeting, DSE ratings for stock, pasture growth rates for different types of pasture, and likewise there's a couple of tools there from the MLA feed demand calculator and the stocking rate calculator from Evergrades, which can help you work through some of those calculations around what are the stock numbers that I've got right now, how will that actually carry forward. In terms of queries, look, certainly, you know, I think Georgie would probably support this in terms of make sure if you've got any queries, filter them back through to the Barossa Improved Grazing group. They can field those or put you in touch with people to address that. And I'm sure that they're always looking for comments and feedback on new ideas and things that you're looking for. Likewise, contact me if you've got any particular queries about some of the discussion points that we've had tonight or on any of the management side of things. There's contact details there, and I think with that we'll fire into a few questions. Carlin, is that right?
Yeah, sure. If anyone's got questions, feel free to raise your hand or type a question and Hamish will answer that for you. There was one a bit earlier, Hamish, that said, what options for January, February rain 2017, but I think we've probably addressed that as we've been going along.
Yeah, look, it's a really challenging period, that sort of January, February rain. A lot of it depends on how much we get as to whether we can actually grow any feed of worthwhile nature out of that. This year, you know, the rainfall that we did have, it pretty much just generated a whole lot of weeds and rubbish. From the livestock point of view, you know, it just grew a lot of heliotrope, a lot of potato weed, a lot of stink grass. It wasn't anything that actually contributed a lot of good value to stock. In terms of utilising that as an opportunity, there can be times when there may be a way of actually scratching in some feed quickly, but you've got to be able to make some projections and decisions around how much feed you're going to grow out of that. If you're only going to get, you know, 6 or 8 weeks growth out of it and it's going to get burnt off again because we're still, you know, in the summer period, then the likely, I guess, reward out of the cost of that, the likely amount of feed that's growing compared to the cost of putting it in is probably not going to be worthwhile. If the seasonal projections, you know, at that point seem to be that you know, we're not getting huge heat waves coming through and you may continue to get some growth out of that even for 2 or 3 months, then, you know, it may well actually provide a return. And working through that's a method of actually looking at what the cost per tonne of dry matter of feed produced is. So that's one way of actually working that out, and that can give you a pretty clear idea of whether it's worth it or not. And likewise, you know, consider your feed budgets in that situation. How desperate are you for feed at that point in time? You know, if you're in a mixed system where you've got plenty of stubbles available to you, you know, it may be that it's not completely worthwhile. Or if you are very short on feed and a small amount makes a big difference, then the value is quite different.
The person's just followed up just talking about maybe some oats, but I think you've just covered off on that. The next question is, what, Hamish, is your favourite data collection, livestock feed stock movement recording software, online tool or app? What's your favourite gadget associated with that record keeping?
This space is an ever-changing space, and I think we're in a pretty exciting time just at the moment where there's a lot of investment in technology, and that includes apps and cloud-based tools and software programs. Look, in terms of particularly mob movements and you know, a livestock system as a whole, some of the products like AgriWeb are actually doing really good things. There are a few other programs that are sort of in the wind at the moment, and I think will probably come online in the next 6 or 12 months that will provide a similar type role. Certainly, if you start getting down to individual animal management systems, then you start looking at some other software programs. But yeah, probably for the moment, in terms of ease of use, one of the programs to have a look at is certainly AgriWeb. One of the things just to be really conscious of, I think, going forward, and I say this to quite a few clients, is be aware going ahead, and this is a longer term discussion, is that, you know, your data is really valuable, and it's a valuable resource to you as a producer, and it's a valuable resource to many other people as well. So make sure you understand where your data is being held and for what purposes at the same time.
Okay. I'll just jump. There's a few questions here in the queue, Hamish, but one's just popped in that's related to data. Where should someone focus for data collection to see grains? Where should someone focus for data collection to see gains in producing meat, producing wool, or a dual-purpose animal?
Yep. Okay. So the really key things to be collecting data in that instance is ultimately what you want to be able to look at is kilos of lamb produced per hectare and equally kilos of wool produced per hectare, and that's your two end pieces of data to look at. Within that, there are a few pieces of information that feed that. So we need to be able to make sure that things like growth rate in the lambs is actually being monitored, and that's important because what that actually drives are things like your stocking rate. If you look at the economic analyses in terms of the effect on profit of growth rate on its own of lambs, for example, it isn't actually particularly high, just improving growth rate on its own. It's useful, but it's not a massive game changer. Where it makes a huge effect is that if you're actually turning lambs off sooner, you are freeing up feed to actually support the ewes better. So you can either potentially run a few more ewes or you can actually run that breeding flock into better condition. So that's why I say growth rate is actually really quite important to monitor and try and continually to improve. So on the wool production side, especially if we're looking at these sort of dual purpose systems, you know, fleece cut is really important. You know, look, the micron premiums are just starting to change around again a little bit now where there's a little bit more value and premium for different micron lines. So it is still of value to make sure that you're watching the micron of the flock so that as you continually push for heavier and heavier cutters, you're not just going broader and broader at the same time. And one of the other things that can occasionally get missed is yield. You know, yield in fleece is actually really important to monitor, especially depending on your environment and where you are. So make sure that that's on the radar. Back on the lamb side, the other big part of how do we actually generate, I guess, high levels of kilo lamb per hectare is having high reproductive rates. It's far better in an environment like ours where we have a very seasonal rainfall pattern to be able to run a breeding flock which is as small in numbers as possible but generates as many lambs as we possibly can. You know, we can either run a slightly smaller enterprise that produces a high number of lambs, or you can run a big enterprise where they're all generally slightly back in condition and our lambing rate is a bit lower. It's far better to run a slightly smaller flock in better condition and generate the same amount of lambs. So certainly lambing rate is important there. And once you start to collect some of that information and also things like pregnancy scanning, it allows you to put your finger onto exactly where the gaps are and where the issues are. If you take reproductive rates as an example, it's one of the most common things that people come to me and say, look, can we actually try and improve our reproductive rates? Well, we think we're doing okay, but there's certainly room for improvement. And you know, the first question I'll go back is say, okay, well, where are we at right now in terms of our lambing rate, in terms of our preg scan rate? And some people don't have that data. If they do, that's the information that we need to put our finger on exactly where we can make improvements, because if we know that, for example, our conception rates are actually really good and our marking rates are comparatively lower, well, we know we need to address a lot of our management and a lot of our management decisions around lambing time, you know, because the lamb losses are the issue. But if, for example, we've got a flock that's, you know, say marking the 110% and they're scanning at 120, 125%, well, the reality is they're getting quite reasonable levels of lamb survival, but we're not getting high enough conception rates. So all of our management, all of our focus needs to go back to that joining period to actually make some difference as well. So that's the sort of data, and that's the importance of it.
All right, I've got some cattle questions here for you, Hamish.
Yep.
As a percentage of livestock body weight, what is a good estimate of intake on a daily basis of a young growing steer?
There's a few things. So look, ballpark figures, young growing steers, you're looking at about 2.8% of live weight. How much they actually consume is also a little bit dependent on the fibre content. Well, there's a few factors. Fibre content of feed, moisture content of feed can affect it as well. So ballpark, that 2.8% of live weight is a good starting point. But just be aware that, you know, if they're on, say, dry or high fibre feed, they're likely not going to achieve that. Or likewise, if they're on quite lush, low fibre feed and or grains, they may go through a bit more than that.
Okay, there's another question here. What do you believe the optimum calving timing is for southeast Victoria dry country?
We've gone through this, I guess, with quite a few clients, and quite often we'll end up come back to a sort of an autumn, early winter calving period. It does vary a little bit client to client, and it's not necessarily one rule for everyone, in that there are different aspects that come into play, and certainly feed availability and getting that aligned to really optimise stocking rates is part of it. But we do also need to be relatively conscious of things like labour limitations, any other enterprises that are on the property at the same time. So there are a few factors that come into play, but that's often where it's ended up.
Okay, there's about 4 to go here on my screen at the moment. We have had a best ever start to the season with rain today and more forecast. We are contemplating winter cleaning some degraded paddocks so that if the season does finish earlier, we will have quality feed.
Yeah, look, it's something that, you know, if the season continues, you know, in the best ever sort of situation that you're having, then certainly there's opportunities to undertake a lot of that sort of activity to try and improve some of those pastures and clean them up. You know, it's a decision that can be made a lot easier by doing some of those feed budgets that we talked about. Going through that exercise will really clearly allow you to say, okay, well, look, we need this area of paddocks, we need of this particular type of feed to support the stock numbers that we've got at the moment. And look, the reality is, if we need to clean these paddocks, and and therefore you're taking out some production for a couple of months there, or you're at least lowering the pasture production for a couple of months for the longer term benefit, then you can assess that really clearly and see, look, that's fine. Given the season that we've got, given the amount of feed that we've got on hand at the moment, that's not going to be a drama. And likewise, when you've got those sorts of scenarios set up, it's relatively easy to then plug in a few different options. You can say, right, well, if the season continues, in an average way, this is how it ends up. Or likewise, if we do actually end up with quite a dry spring, you can actually assess that and see, okay, well, where does that leave us? Will it actually really put us in a hole that we shouldn't have made that decision, or are we still quite fine? So yeah, so there's ways of actually really assessing that. But yeah, look, opportunities like that are exactly the type of thing that it pays to be on the ball with and see if you can take advantage of that given the season conditions now.
All right. The next one is there a resource to help learn how to calculate current feed on offer and project feed on offer through winter and into spring? Maybe using median rainfall as a guideline and adjust as actual rainfall is delivered.
Yep. So the things that I would recommend to look at is in terms of current feed on offer, have a look at the AWI feed on offer library. If you Google feed on offer library or FOO library, it will come up with a website which gives you a whole lot of photo standards for different types of pastures at different amounts. So that can allow you to visually make an estimate as to how much feed on offer is available on the place right now. And as we sort of discussed in that feed budgeting technique, that's part of it, because we do need to work out whether we have half a tonne to the hectare or we've got 5 tonne to the hectare of feed available right at this moment. And then in terms of projecting forward with pasture growth rates, once again, I probably would start at having a look at those resources like making more from sheep and more beef from pastures. Within those websites, there is information available on the typical pasture growth rates of a range of different pastures in different regions. So it will take it down to different states and different regions within those states, so you'll be able to see that. So yeah, I think Carlin's just put that information up there now. So there you go. So it's, for the feed on offer, it's www.feedonofferlibrary.com, and there's some information there. Like I said, in terms of the process of working through it, it's available online as well. You'll find some links to the tools there.
Okay. There's just 2 to go here, Hamish. In a pasture-fed beef enterprise, selling beef raised using pasture or grass only, no grain, what crops can be planted to give summer feed?
So with no grain, I'm not sure whether there's a bit of a pasture-fed assurance basis to that, whether we can't actually go with any grain there at all in this particular place. But certainly from a summer option, depends on environment, but I'd be looking at potentially trying to still grow a lot of that feed through winter and or spring, especially in a season where there's better projections for the spring rainfall, because the reality is if you're located in somewhere like the Barossa or the mid-north of SA, where we have a very seasonal rainfall pattern, trying to rely on a summer feed resource to grow is a pretty risky strategy. And the reality with a lot of the summer fodder crops that come into play, things like forage brassicas and even some of the millets and those sorts of things, they grow very well, very, very well where we have late spring and summer rainfall, but it's often the seasons when we don't have that rainfall that we're actually really looking for them. So I would still be looking at actually potentially putting in some options. Even rye clover pastures can actually keep producing relatively good levels of feed through that sort of even October, November if rainfall's still a little bit limited, provided they've actually been set up quite well through winter and early spring. Otherwise, then I'd still be potentially even looking at a sown feed option, whether it's some cereal with likewise some vetch in there or something like that as well for a little bit of protein coming in. If you're in the environment where you've got lucerne, look, certainly some contribution of that, not necessarily all, but a part lucerne in the mix can help provide some quality and some growth if you do get that summer rain at the same time.
Okay, the last question tonight, Hamish, is a urea question, and it's got multiple parts to it, so we'll see how we go. We might need to email this person afterwards and maybe ask offline, but I'll see how I go. So yep. Would it be better to spread 60 kilos a hectare twice a month apart, or put 80 kilos a hectare on once right now?
I will probably say we might take that one offline a little bit, partly because I actually also put them in contact with someone better qualified than me to tackle that comment at the same time, especially given the time right now. Yep.
Okay, no problem. So we'll park that question, and we've got that in our system, and we'll follow that up with that person offline. So that's all the questions we've got at the moment. So thanks everybody. If well, I just want to. Is there any other final comments you wanted to have to wrap up, Hamish?
No, look, I think we'll leave it there. Thanks again. It's been really good.
Awesome. Just before we go tonight, I just want to do a plug on behalf of Georgie. Georgie, do you want to talk about your event coming up in June?
Yes, 22nd of June, it's a Thursday, to carry on from this webinar, looking at the way that we can make the most opportunities for this season. We have a climate, preparing for the climate workshop. It's being held in Maculture in the Barossa. We've got all these different speakers that you can see up on screen, Dr. Peter Heyman, Dr. Jason Tromp, and also a Nuffield scholar, Robin Schaefer, mostly livestock related, and it will be a brilliant day. Limited at 20 people, so you can go to our website and get information about it that way, as Carlin has done. Also, in wrapping up for tonight, I would like to thank both Carlin and Hamish for pulling this webinar together. As a farmer, the information that Hamish just provided us with was brilliant. I've got heaps and heaps of notes to take back to my group, and so thank you very much. Very relevant and very timely, so thank you very much, Hamish, and thank you, Carlin, for pulling it all together. It's run very well as per normal. If everyone, I think Carlin's about to say, but please fill out this evaluation survey at the end. Gives us lots of information about where to target our resources and what information you guys want to receive from us. In conclusion, I would also like to thank again our partners MLA and Natural Resources SA Murray-Darling Basin for their support with this webinars as well. So thank you very much, Carlin.
Yeah, thanks, Georgie. I just want to just reiterate that as people exit, the evaluation survey will pop up, so it'll just take a couple of minutes of your time. But thanks everybody for tonight, and we'll forward the recording around to all of you in the next few days. Thanks.
And Carlin, we will also include some links to some of those websites that Hamish talked about. We'll include that in the email that comes out with the recording.
No worries. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.